right? Like, I know what philanthropy's role isn't, at least in my mind. Philanthropy's role is not to replace government. I've worked with enough philanthropists over the years that have really like felt strongly that there's the role of government and there's the role of philanthropy, and all of philanthropy could spend all of its resources on, say, hunger, let's just say, and we'd be out of money by Tuesday and have a lot of needs still. So clearly there's a role for philanthropy and a role for government. And so thinking about the role of philanthropy in this pandemic, I think a few roles that it's played is it certainly brought people together, and it's sort of rekindled like a collective spirit. Like, I even remember back in the really early days, seeing volunteers out or collecting food or going shopping for their elderly neighbors, or maybe giving $20 on, Kickstarter, or for a fundraiser for a senior who's in the hospital. And all of that is expressions of philanthropy that I think we've definitely seen and continue to see. Clearly, and this is something that we talk a lot about at Leichtag, philanthropy as a field can really champion and strengthen nonprofits. And what I mean by that, and change makers, is in addition to the financial resources, philanthropy can use its voice and multiple tools at its disposal in order to, for example, pledge to ease restrictions on, grants that they might be making to nonprofits in the face of a crisis. This as one example that I know you both were involved in that kind of an effort. Kind of nonprofits represent civil society, but philanthropy can provide the resources that are flexible enough for them to execute their mission in the ways that are most timely. Another thing that I really thought about at this moment is that philanthropy raises really critical concerns that often get overlooked. I mean, equity is one of them. Philanthropy is the risk capital of social change, or can be the risk capital of social change. Philanthropy by its nature can take more risk than government, at least some feel that. And so if you look at important issues, often it is philanthropy. Over time, it's philanthropy that has brought them to the fore, that has been the pioneers in support, and then government sort of follows. And I think, there's many other roles, but finally, philanthropy can really play. We think about this a lot at being a local foundation. You're both more national, in your orientation. And I think our goal today is to discuss more the national trends that you're seeing. But when you look locally, like even Felicia, thinking about you in Brooklyn, I remember one of the first things that I saw during this pandemic was, I think, a fund that had been set up at the Brooklyn Community Foundation. I think it was something in Brooklyn, local to Brooklyn, that was rallying local Brooklynites around their neighbors who were ill, and was very local and tangible in ways that people and foundations could give. So rallying communities, bringing communities around a certain goal. So there's a lot, there's clearly like a lot of roles for philanthropy. One of the debates is always, do you kind of put the Band-Aid on the bleed, or do you look at the heart condition that's causing the bleed? And so the long-term versus the short-term, but really in the world of philanthropy, we're looking to run a sprint and a marathon at the same time often. And we're gonna delve into all of those issues and important questions today, plus more. So I think with that, I will get to our speakers. Oh, I did want to say one more thing, just to mention for those of you who hadn't seen it earlier this month, Giving USA, which is an organization that puts out statistics every year about how much Americans are giving, where they're giving to. It's really interesting. If you Google Giving USA, they just reported earlier this month the 2019 results, and about almost $450 billion was given to U.S. charities in 2019. It was among the highest years ever for charitable giving. I think 2017 was a little bit more, but it was the largest share ever and the largest amount ever from the sector of foundations. And Felicia and Barry both, and I too, we all work for foundations. So from that sector, foundations have never been that big a piece of the pie as in 2019. Foundations represented about $76 billion of that $450 billion. So that was really interesting, and you can see more about where things were, where it was given, and how the approaches that individuals and foundations took on that Giving USA report. But I did want to mention that. And so far, according to the Giving USA report, obviously the 2019 numbers did not cover the pandemic or any of this, but they reported some optimism. I mean, at least in the second quarter, from what they could see, philanthropy remained real strong. Potentially, they speculated due to the market. I mean, there's a lot of speculation about why, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Maybe our guests have some prognostication that they'll do. I hope, but that was interesting. So with that, I'm gonna ask each of our guests to just quickly describe yourself, your background, and your work at your foundation, quickly what the foundation does. So Felicia, let's just, can we start with you? And thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this series. One of the, I was just getting distracted scrolling through the list of participants, and it's a really fun list with a lot of mutual friends sort of all of us on the list. So I'm really glad to be with you all for this brief time. So I'm the executive director of Natan, which is here in New York. And Natan, it's funny to talk about individual giving versus foundation giving, because Natan sort of exists in the middle of that, because although Natan is a grant-making foundation, we're set up as a giving circle. So in any given year, we have 50, 60, 70 member units. Sometimes that's an individual, sometimes a couple, who join Natan, make contributions into our different grant committees, and then they themselves go through the process of reading grant applications and making the decisions. And there are two pieces that are sort of really interesting, I think, about that model for philanthropy, and even for philanthropy in this moment. One is that it really is an opportunity, giving circles generally are an opportunity for individual givers to have a lot more impact than they could necessarily on their own, both in terms of being able to leverage each other's financial contributions, and in terms of being able to leverage each other's wisdom and perspectives and ideas. So I think our grant making tables are much smarter, than any of us, and myself included, would be on our own, because we're constantly learning new things from each other and changing each other's minds. So there's the model for the funders. And then the other piece of Natan that gives us an unusual place in the philanthropic landscape is that we're focused on funding innovation. So we fund what we call Jewish and Israeli social innovation. On the Israeli side, for the past several years, have been partnering actually with our good friends at the Leichtag Foundation on funding urban renewal in Jerusalem. And then otherwise we'll fund different issues around Jewish communities sort of around the rest of the world. And there we have been really privileged, I would say, to be able to help a lot of new organizations get off the ground and then evolve over their first several years. So we'll talk maybe later about risk. Like, that is risk capital. That's like a group of funders who came together to say that they themselves realized that they were risk tolerant, and in their funding really were willing to go first, willing to take risks on new ideas and new leaders. And so it's been really a privilege to be part of Natan for a very long time. And a few years ago, we launched something called Amplifier, which is a network of giving circles inspired by Jewish values. Some, like Natan, that focus on Jewish issues, others that focus on sort of anything but are substantively inspired by Jewish values. So I'm very happy through any of these questions to talk about the power of collaborative giving, because I feel like that's what we've been doing all these years, and that it really does offer a model that most people are not aware of in terms of thinking about how they can engage in philanthropy.
Thanks, Felicia. Barry, who are you and why are you here?
Hi, everybody. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you and nod to Charlene and her colleagues at Leichtag for putting this together. And always an honor to sit on any panel with Felicia Herman. So I'm Barry Finestone, President and CEO of the Jim Joseph Foundation. Jim Joseph Foundation is a foundation devoted exclusively to supporting Jewish education of youth and young adults in the United States. Jim passed away of blessed memory about 17 years ago, and created this foundation on his passing. The foundation supports a number of different grantees throughout North America to the tune of about $55–60 million every year. Just a quick thing about me, so that you maybe don't listen to what I'm saying, but just the way I'm saying it. I am from Glasgow, Scotland. And yes, there are Jews from Glasgow, Scotland, and that could happily be the topic of another discussion that we will have. I'm happy to talk about it at some other time. And then the other thing I just wanted to say by way of introduction is that I often, when I'm asked questions, I'm also asked, as a philanthropist, people will ask me, they'll say, well, as a philanthropist, Barry, and I just want to be clear that, I'm not a philanthropist. I mean, my wife and I are philanthropists, and the, relatively small amount of money, obviously, compared to the foundation that we're able to give away. But I'm a steward of a philanthropy, of a family foundation that is set up. We have a board, and I recognize that as president and CEO, I am the leader of that organization. But ultimately, being a perpetual endowment, I'm a blip in the radar. And I just wanted to call that out a little bit in initial, because I think there are philanthropists, there are professionals who run foundations, the spectrum of how people give and how people choose to work, has a pretty wide scope. So there are different rules and different mechanisms that some of us use.
Thanks for saying that. I might steal that for my introductions. I like that. I'm a steward. It's so true. So maybe starting with you, Barry, while I was going to say, well, you're unmuted, but you're still muted. So maybe you could just share what some of the first steps the Jim Joseph Foundation took, and then followed by Felicia with the same question for Natan, immediately after the pandemic was declared, and then just if you saw any kind of other foundations following your lead in those sorts of first steps.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I guess, like anything else that happens that is of a very dramatic nature in life, I think it is very common to, first of all, is to look internally, right? Like, what does this mean to us, right? So I appreciate the question because it gave me a little time to reflect. So when it first happened, our first concern was, well, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for the people working at the foundation? What does this mean for our current grantees? Right? That was very much, it was a very inward-looking moment, and I say that, with pride in some respects, right? We wanted to take care of our family. And our family in the professional term meant our people that do the work every day, and our grantee partners who are out there each and every day, doing the great work that they do. I think what's different about this one is it became very clear to me very early on that while we would remain focused on that, and that was primarily a major task of the vast majority of our team, my professional colleagues at the foundation, it became clear to me very early on that we also needed to be looking outside, that this was obviously not just local, but it was obviously national, international, etc. We can get into the hows and whats, but it became very clear that there was a group of other foundation colleagues who were, okay, let's try and begin to work together. And so I would say that the gap between working individually and working collectively was 0 to 60. That was driving a Maserati. It was 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. Let's figure it out. And very quickly we put out a letter that plenty of people signed on to, and, you know, and other things. And for me, that the contents of that letter are one thing, but I think the notion that the rapidity of pace was a recognition that something was, you know, something was different, you know, there. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, which relates back to how we all work differently, is it also meant a very different mechanism for how we work with our board. You know, I happen to be blessed with, you know, an amazing group of 10 other board members. And we're in a rhythm. We meet quarterly and we get updates, and there are committees and different things. But this was going to require something different. This was going to require, you know, weekly updates and moving out of pace and whatever. And I'll just finish by saying that for me, the recognition that life was different, that this was different, came from everybody. Right? It wasn't, nobody had to be convinced that this was something different. And, you know, maybe a bit later, I think there are magnificent lessons that hopefully will stay beyond COVID, that I think we can draw upon from what we learned during that time.
So our trajectory was pretty similar. We started, of course, by looking at Natan members, our team, which is very small, especially compared to Barry's, and starting to reach out to our grantees just to sort of think about, and all around the world, to see how this was affecting them. It was interesting actually to have Israel go before us, before the United States, you know, in terms of going through COVID and going through lockdowns and trying to, you know, we've started those conversations even before we ourselves were in lockdown, because we were talking to our Israeli grantees about what they were seeing. So that actually was kind of helpful to think about what we also might be seeing. And that letter that Barry referenced briefly, we should actually spend a little bit more time on, because that was a really important letter. That was the letter was really driven by, I think, Jim Joseph and Schusterman and several other foundations that I don't remember how many signed on to it. We did sign on to it, and it went out in E-Jewish Philanthropy really at the very beginning. What was really beautiful about that letter was that it articulated a lot of different practices for foundations to undertake at a time of crisis that really are, you know, that we're all, I think, really in service of the grantees, of like really understanding, really having empathy for the grantees and how difficult their situation was and was about to be. And those of us who signed on to it, and many other foundations for sure, have undertaken practices like being incredibly flexible with reporting, with getting checks out the door, with understanding the cash flow crises that organizations were in, trying to make decisions quickly, as Barry was saying, like more quickly and in different ways than we usually make decisions. And really, I think putting, not only having empathy for what organizations were facing, but really trusting them, like really putting a lot of trust in the organizations that we invest in terms of, you know, them also having an open relationship with us as a funder in terms of being able to tell us what things they were seeing and needing at the time. We did a very small emergency fund also that we raised some extra money from some of our members to deal with, to help support some of our grantees who were dealing with particularly hard hit communities. And I wrote an article early on for Tablet that was about trying to let other people know, because I think let other people know what was about to hit the Jewish communal world. And everything that was in that article, I learned from my colleagues in the philanthropy universe. And what Barry just said something about, you know, we didn't need to bring anybody up to speed, like everybody sort of understood what was about to happen. I think actually that especially in the beginning and even until now, there's a whole universe of people that really don't understand the impact of this on nonprofits and maybe on the Jewish communal system in particular. And even we are learning every single day about the, like, okay, what happens next? And what's the next piece of the crisis that emerges? You know, whereas maybe in the beginning it felt like an emergency and we're all working incredibly fast. Now it just feels like a rolling, ongoing crisis with new problems, like almost like COVID cases, like new spikes, you know, and new things that emerge, new pockets of trouble. So that article, as I said, like came out of multiple conversations with different colleagues, and all of the three of us and all of our colleagues are really involved in lots of different groups where we are learning from each other. And that has been a tremendous blessing, I think, you know, for all of us. And I think has really important impacts on the field, that folks outside of that universe should know how much foundation professionals and nonprofit executives and all of us and federation executives, how much we're talking to each other so that we all can try to wrap our arms around this enormous issue that we're all facing, learn from each other, and then spread the word to our different communities as much as we can.
And I think that, you know, from what I've been reading, you know, that was definitely, I think a lot of foundations stepped forward, as you did, as we did as well, to really release restrictions, be really flexible, look at things a little differently. I mean, I think the jury's still out as to like whether or not that's going to last, but if that could, if it could result in like a lasting change to our field that, you know, has not historically been the most flexible, it's a very interesting direction for it to go in. And so you both of you were really some of the leaders in that. And so that was really important. So we talked about risk a little bit. And so I want to talk a little bit about risk. It's funny, I was talking to our JCC director, fabulous director, the other day, and they rolled out their camp program actually on Monday. I think they started, and she told her camp director, she said, like, throw out the previous program books on camp. I mean, this is not going to look like any camp we've ever seen before. And so we just can't be wedded to that model. And that's sort of the advice that at least I've been giving, you know, some of our organizational partners, because my sense from speaking to philanthropists and even from thinking about our own appetite, and I think we already, at least I had a fairly high tolerance towards risk. I mean, we chose Jerusalem as you did, Felicia, like, I mean, there's no greater risk than that, but we also feel like there's no greater return. So my sense is that the bar is really low on risk, right? I mean, in a very, you know, maybe a positive way, that like, this is a time that there is more tolerance for risk than I've seen before from our field. I'm curious about what you two have to say about that. And so that, you know, has a lot of upside, and then there's some, you know, concerns as well. So maybe you can kind of reflect on that, starting with Felicia, each of you, the relationship you see, both sort of as a professional in the field, maybe also as reflected by your foundation, between risk and philanthropy, and what philanthropy's role should be.
Such a good question. And I think also that we're talking about risk and innovation at the same time. I mean, I think they're kind of the same thing. Like, on what, you know, as people innovate, are you willing to invest in innovation? Are you willing to take risks on things that haven't been tried before? And I would say that we're for sure in a moment, we're in like a good tsunami of innovation. Everyone is forced to innovate, like your JCC director, every institution, you know, hopefully every funder, but certainly like every institution is forced to innovate all at once. And I think we're going to see incredible new things. We are already seeing incredible new things emerge out of that. One of those things, hopefully, is risk tolerance. So as I said, that Natan, from the very beginning, when our founding members got together, they realized that they were much more risk tolerant. They were younger, they were investors, they were willing to take on risks that other funders weren't necessarily willing to take on. And that could be offer unique value in the philanthropic ecosystem, because somebody does need to go first. Somebody does need to fund, you know, an idea that as it comes out, a social entrepreneur or a startup. So we're very risk tolerant, which has served us well over the years and serves us well in this moment, because I think as I was saying, what we keep seeing in this moment is like, well, what if we tried this? And what if we tried that? And having a mindset that is accustomed to that you know, that kind of ambiguity, right? Like we have no idea if this is going to work, but it sounds really good. That like decision-making process, which can be very quick and sometimes intuitive, instinctive, sort of rather than a lengthy, data-driven, you know, research-oriented process, that I think is very useful in a moment like this when we actually have no idea what the future is going to look like. We can trust that really smart people who are working very hard and doing their best, you know, and understand their communities and the issues at hand. I think we just need to trust that some of their ideas, many of their ideas are going to be good, even if we actually can't see what the future is going to look like in the future. And another piece of this I also think is really important is something that Barry said actually very early on in all of this, which is about also just giving people a lot of grace, being very generous and understanding that people are going to make mistakes in a time like this, that we are also going to make mistakes at a time like this, and at a time where everybody is working so hard to solve so many problems in the world, that we all just need to really be very generous with each other, with our philanthropic colleagues, with our boards, with our grantees, in realizing that everybody's really doing their best in a tough time. And to really be comfortable, this is another element with the idea that we just don't know what's going to happen. That I feel like if I were into mindfulness, which I keep thinking that I should do because everybody says it is really good for you, that would be the thing I would work on the most, is like embracing ambiguity, you know, and not knowing that I don't know what the outcome is going to be, and I can't necessarily engineer for a particular outcome, and I just have to sort of accept that like something good will happen.
I guess I want to take the question in a kind of slightly different direction. I mean, you know, certainly related to the risk piece of the puzzle. You know, whenever we're hiring at the foundation, you know, if we're like hiring a new program officer, you know, my general rule of thumb is you can't work at the foundation unless you've had some experience working in the field. That you have to understand what it means like to, you know, work for an organization that has to make payroll and deals with HR issues and all the other stuff. And I think what has happened during COVID is that you know, I often say that in philanthropy, if philanthropy is a 20-story building, you can choose to be on the ground floor. That means you're an operating foundation, right? And you can choose to be in the 20th floor, kind of, you know, giving money and, you know, being the generals on the hills, so to speak. And I think, you know, certainly Jim Joseph, we tried to kind of position ourselves kind of on the first or second floor. You know, we're really close. We're close enough if you need us, and we're close enough if you know, to see and understand. I think this moment has I would like to think that this moment has made philanthropy understand just all that grantees have to deal with, right? And in that respect, I think it has probably lowered the bar on risk, right? You know, where you're actually really, you know, people are actually making incredibly painful, difficult decisions about who stays in a job and who doesn't stay in a job, as well as pivoting on the program side of things. So the leeway has been, you know, the lane has gotten wider for what I think philanthropy will accept, and I hope that continues. I think there's something underneath the question all about the general operating support versus program funding support. We're very proud of the fact that for our core grantees, we're big believers in general operations, and not specifically tied to programs, and that inherently allows for some more risk to happen, right? You know, yeah, we've given them general operating support. There's a plan for that operating support, but it's not all. You know, money is fungible, and if they see direction that they want to go down. I also think that the question about risk requires, and this is where I think philanthropy still generally struggles, it requires what I would term as tremendous selflessness on the backs of the foundation and on the board, etc. Because often risk requires a long time to play out to see whether or not it has actually been worthwhile. And, you know, board members change and staffs turn over and all of that stuff. And, you know, you might not be around the table, right? So I think people generally move away from risk because they want to see that their efforts, whether professional or lay, are actually leading to change during their tenure. And certainly, you know, certainly at Jim Joseph Foundation, we're trying to position risk and R&D and things as this long-term play. And, you know, if the things that we happen to put in place can have an impact 10 years from now, well, I'm probably not going to be around this table in 10 years. And therefore, you know, are we okay with that? So I think there's something about that. And then the other thing I just say is that, which is, you know, there is a sense out there that from people outside of philanthropy that there's some type of, you know, super secret conversation where we all get to decide, you know, who lives and who dies, and, you know, and you know, frankly, alibi, like that should happen, right? Like we should be that good, you know. But I think, you know, the same is very much true for you know, for risk. It's a very difficult thing to coordinate around. You know, some people who have made their money and are now giving it away did it because they were all about risk, and other people were, and that plays a piece in the puzzle. But I guess just to answer your question directly, I'll finish with, I think there is a general sense that the bar has been lowered, and that I'm just not convinced that that will remain post-COVID.
So so I want to turn next. First of all, the questions are kind of rolling in, which is great. I just want to say that I have 2 more questions that I'll discuss with Felicia and Barry, and then we'll definitely get to your questions. So please keep them coming. So I want to talk about collaboration. That came up a lot, in partnerships, and even related back to risk. Because one of the things that I think, you know, we've seen in the last few months, at least I've seen from the Jewish community, that I was really surprised about. You know, I have my sort of model that more tends to maybe be on the ground floor, let's say, and maybe not value as much the 20th floor. I mean, that's my, I will confess that. And one of the things that I think I was really just blown away by was the mosaic or the puzzle that did come together. Like, for example, the Federation movement, given their incredible experience around government relations and around disaster and crisis management, they leveraged the most incredible capacity building effort that I've seen. I mean, I was so impressed with the way that they positioned and trained organizations super quickly to get ready to apply for the PPP loans. That was like nothing I've ever seen before. And they were able to leverage their long expertise as a legacy institution, you know, in disaster and in collective. And so that was kind of a role that there was to play. And one of our favorite colleagues also reminded me yesterday that federations, even our focus today is around foundations and the response to the COVID, but federations have really been at the forefront in a lot of ways in responding to this pandemic. So that is, you know, a type of partnership that, you know, maybe with all the talk about risk and innovation, maybe some of us would have been quick to dismiss that. And yet, wow, that really came to the forefront. So that was really interesting in terms of how we were able to leverage the best strengths. So then turning to collaborative philanthropy, because there's been a lot of talk, you know, in our field, and there always is, nonprofits are going to merge out of this, or they're going to go away, and there needs to be more nonprofit mergers, and these two should go together. And sometimes, in general, this isn't about any, sometimes the conversations that I've been part of feel a little bit cavalier, you know, like, okay, just that's easy. These two nonprofits should just, you know, combine, of course. course. And sometimes philanthropy isn't very good at that, right? Like foundations aren't great at working together, like even to have a common grant application, so that nonprofits with stretched resources need to fill out, multiple grant applications and then fill out multiple reports and then hire, multiple people to track all this, and then get criticized by those same foundations for having too much red tape or too much overhead. All of that an intro to. So you both have sort of led and modeled a very different approach in this disaster. And Felicia, you can describe it a little bit, but you're on loan from the Natan Fund to direct whoever made this decision, Barry, was just brilliant to bring in the best person, from my view, to direct this effort, which
I was fully responsible. I was fully responsible for a brilliant decision. So I just want to
you deserve a bonus, and I have no influence on on that process, but that was kudos. And so a number of foundations got together quickly to establish the Jewish Community Relief and Impact Fund nationally. And I will say that some of those collaborative efforts have also been reflected locally. Like locally, we're really proud to be partnering with our federation and with our Jewish Community Foundation for the San Diego Jewish COVID disaster response, probably for some of the same reasons that the national foundations got together. So Felicia, can you start and tell us a little bit about the Jewish Community Relief and Impact Fund? I'm really resisting saying JCRIF because all these acronyms in the Jewish world just drive me crazy. And just how did it get started? Why are the funders coming together? Because even though it does apply to a national context, which you should focus on, we see some similar patterns happening locally.
It's funny to talk about this because actually it was Barry's idea, this fund. So he can just, he can correct anything that I say that is incorrect. Barry and Lisa Eisen of the Schusterman Foundation and Mark Cherendorf of the Maimonides Fund, I think, started talking really from like moment number one or moment number zero of all of this about how could foundations work together to have, like I said, to sort of wrap their arms around the entire Jewish communal infrastructure, try to figure out how we could provide the most assistance possible to all of the different sectors of Jewish life, like the ones that we know of, the camps and the JCCs and the day schools, and then much, beyond that into all of the different kinds of organizations that don't fall into any of those categories. So their visionary idea was like, let's put together a fund. And I think it started as a loan fund, and then the grant fund evolved out of the loan fund. And it's actually a Jewish Community Response and Impact Fund. And we do call it JCRIF, so I'm just going to call it JCRIF because it's too long of a name. The one thing that I think Barry is fully responsible for is like way too long a name. But it was also actually based on the New York Community Response and Impact Fund, something like that. That was also a partnership of a bunch of major foundations here in New York, primarily to help cultural institutions here in New York. Of course, like everything had to shut down all at once. And so all these museums and theaters and things have all suffered tremendously in this moment. So, and that fund as well is a loan and grant fund. So JCRIF includes a very, I think the best loan capital you can get, the most generous loan capital you can get in the Jewish world or anywhere else, which is a no interest loan that you don't have to start paying back for a year, and that is repayable entirely over 4 years for any kind of Jewish communal institution. No interest loans, of course, have a long history in Jewish communities. So it builds off of that, and there's that sort of values piece of it, which is really beautiful. But one of the stories eventually that'll be told about this is how these loans played a part in the in this moment in history, and then and how that will play out in Jewish communal life moving forward. Because until this, I think most organizations are just not used to loans. I mean, unless you have a property and you're taking, and you have a mortgage on your property or something, most organizations don't deal with loans. So the grant fund, so I'm directing the grant fund. It's an aligned grant fund, which means that the partners in the grant fund have committed a certain amount of money to give to applications that come in through that grant fund. So it's not unlike Natan. Natan is like everybody contributes to a shared pool, and then we make decisions out of that, with that kind of shared pot of money. This is multiple pots of money which is another fascinating piece of this. And one day when I write my book, this will be a fascinating piece of it, is watching. It's an incredible privilege to watch all of these foundations think through issues, some of which they deal with on an everyday basis, organizations, some of which they deal with on an everyday basis. So sometimes it's like things things a foundation knows very well. But the mandate of the grant fund is to fund to look at the entire Jewish communal infrastructure. So then there's also this whole other pocket of discussions about sectors that the foundations don't necessarily fund on a daily basis, and where, how does this emergency funding sort of fit into the foundation's overall daily mindset? And it's been fascinating to watch that unfold, to really see funders take responsibility for the whole system, which doesn't mean that we're in any way able to fund the whole system. That was part of the unfortunate sort of assumption, I guess, of like this fund, which is very large. It's $91 million. Most of that is in the loan fund. But the notion is that, wow, if you put all that money together, you can solve everybody's problems. And as you said in the very beginning, Charlene, like even if we devoted it all just to one sector tomorrow, we couldn't solve everybody's problems. So we're trying to be very strategic, trying to look at the full picture of the whole system, trying to learn from each other. So there's also a whole collaborative philanthropy piece of this that is also fascinating to watch unfold, in terms of foundations that sometimes work together, sometimes don't work together, to see how everyone is working together in this moment. But really, really trying to understand, like, what is the future? What is the moment? What is the crisis right in front of us? How do we address that? And how do we start to set some balls in motion to help us to get to the other side of this? And I'm very conscious when I say certain things like get to the other side, that Barry's the one who said all these things in the very beginning, like saw so much of this happening. And if I had a better accent, Scottish accent, like I always hear it in my head in a Scottish accent, but I'm not going to embarrass myself with the Scottish accent. So I really do want to give a lot of credit to Barry, and not trying to, like, so totally authentically to Barry and to Lisa and to Mark and to the partners that they brought on right away into the fund, who really saw that, like, this is a big issue, is going to require new ways of working together to try to resolve it.
All right, Barry, now we get to hear your accent firsthand. So reflect on that, but also, Jim Joseph has been involved in a number of collaboratives. You've initiated collaboratives, you've joined collaboratives. And so just to the broader issue was around collaborative philanthropy and how you see it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the kind words, Felicia. I think it's one of the questions that I saw there. I mean, the main goal of this was a simple one. If we operate in the same way that we have been operating, the need will not be dealt with, or a piece of the need, as I say, a slice of the pie will not be dealt with in a fast enough fashion. I think there was major recognition that the need to cut red tape here in some way, shape, or form required something different. And so the phrase that I've been using, that others have used as well, is we all coordinate with one another. We very rarely collaborate. Okay, and the and the story here, my chapter of the book is, we all gave up a piece of ourselves in order to try and help the greater good, right? And I'm not looking for pats on the back. I'm stating what are the ingredients necessary for things like this to happen. So that's number one, right? There are things that we are now giving loans to or grants to that we have never funded before and probably might not fund afterwards. But this moment said that we need to do this, and so we did it. So I think that's kind of like a big learn. The notion of trying to move at pace, and I think we have, and I would also say that we did not do it fast enough. And that's just a function of, when you're bringing together partners that have never worked before, that gets very difficult. I will say, if you had asked me to name the 7 funders most likely to join this effort, the 7 that have collaborated would not have been on the list. I mean, I think 2 or 3 of us would have. I don't think the others have, and that's a huge nod to them. And I also want to be really clear, and it's by no way a diss to others that didn't, right? Everybody has their own systems. It goes back to that grace and humility. Everybody's doing their best. Some are local, some are dealing with needs, social service, some are working outside of the Jewish community. There's no bad way of giving money in this crisis, right? Everybody's doing their slice of it. I think for the foundation, it was also related to an R&D moment. This foundation has never, ever in its history given a loan. We've never done PRIs. I mean, this is a PRI play, right? I mean, that's what this is. It's a program-related investment. We're going to get out money. It's going to come back. We're going to have some default rate, right? Just like anything else. So we had to embrace it, right? In everything that we do. So I think that's a significant lesson. And the other thing that I think this moment takes is the recognition that no matter what it is that you try and do, you're just going to have pot shots taken at you all the time, and that's okay, right? And I actually think that in this moment, I'm often asked by younger people who are entering the Jewish field, what's the one skill set that you need to have to be a one personality trait that you need to have to work in the Jewish community? And I say you have to have a thick skin, right? You can't take anything personally. And I would just say, like in this moment, I think thick skins need to be replaced by coats of armor and by suits of armor, that because there's so much need out there, and there's so much yes, we are making some decisions that are going to positively affect some organizations and not affect others. And I think that we're going into it with the Dan Lachaf Zechut, like with giving, we're trying to give our grantees the benefit of the doubt, and we also require the benefit of the doubt, on our end. I will finally say that that this experience has taught me that that I can see a permanent loan fund or a permanent aligned grant fund being part of what the foundation does in the future. Right? That's a discussion that I would love to have with our board, with our professional team, that we've been giving away our money 100% one way. What happens if we said, well, maybe we're going to give 90% of it that way, but we're going to give 10% of it that way? That to me, has been a great gift. And notwithstanding all the kind comments, this has been an enormous lift, from a number of people in front of the scenes and behind the scenes. It takes a village, of which Felicia and Shira Hutt and the other anchor funders and many others, have played a real strong part of.
Thank you. Really so interesting it'll be to watch how these trends, whether it's this, aligned grant making or risk or whatever, how they play out, in a whatever post-COVID world looks like, or even a midterm. So we're getting questions, and I do want to get to them, and please submit them, but I don't want to let the moment pass by. So I do want to ask you, as we sit in this moment where we are engaged in national conversation and maybe more about racial injustice, systemic racism, and inequity, the pandemic has certainly revealed that, or has brought that to sharper light, among other things. I really want to hear from each of you, just it doesn't have to be your foundation's view, even just your personal reflections on what role you think the Jewish community, it's a question I've been asked a lot, so I'm asking you recently, what is there a unique, what should the Jewish community be doing? What should we as Jews be doing? What should we be funding in this moment? Whoever wants to start can start.
I'm happy to go first. So I that's an impossible question to answer, because there is no one Jewish community, and there's no one answer to that. There's no one set of Jewish values that we could say leads us in one direction. I mean, part of the beauty of the Jewish people, as we have encoded literally in our texts, like in the Talmud, is that we disagree with each other a lot, right? So I think we could basically, assume that we all want to make the world a better place. I just think how we get there looks really different for different kinds of people. And there's no end of things that we need to worry about and think about and try to figure out how to, sort of solve and address. And so that leads me sort of back to giving circles, actually, because I really feel like there's one of the things I think a lot about is empowerment. So not necessarily, I don't think generally in terms of equity, I think in terms of empowerment. How can we really give people the opportunity to use their own power, like to use their own voice, their own ideas, to come together with like-minded people to really make the change that they want to see in the world? And that's always the language that we use for giving circles. Obviously, giving circles are just the philanthropic expression of that. Kind of collective power. And you see this obviously in like the protests, are people coming together and using their power and literally like putting their bodies, in service of the goals that they're trying to achieve. People think about, Barry actually said this in the beginning when he was saying like, are he and his wife philanthropists? And he sort of like struggled over that. Like, we're all philanthropists, we all have the ability, and even if we have almost no money, like we all have the ability to make change in the world, the change that we want to see with our giving. Those of us who don't have as much money, as the mega funders and the foundations, like then generally we need to do that in partnership with others. That's where giving circles come in. That's where federations come in, groups of people sort of banding together, usually, but not always, around shared values, and and really using their own power. And I think that part of what I think is beautiful, I'll just put it like in a positive and constructive way. Part of what I think is beautiful about these kinds of models is that it really focuses people on their own ability to change the world, as opposed to saying that like we're waiting for somebody else to change it. And this is like, we're not going to get into this, but one of the arguments that is in the philanthropy world right now is about participatory grant making, right? Should we be opening up philanthropy boards, foundation boards to kind of anyone, like people from the communities that they serve, to sit on those boards and be part of decision making? And I do think that that is part of the philanthropic puzzle now and for the future. There's also just this need to bring so many more voices generally to the ecosystem, so many more people engaged thoughtfully in what it means to make change through their giving, and to really be exploring their own values, their own goals, to give thoughtfully in ways that can, even if they're not fully strategic, that are at least strategic-ish, thoughtful and intentional to make change in the world. So that's the frame in which I see a lot of these kinds of discussions, whether it's around racial issues or kind of anything else. Like anyone who feels marginalized can also use this tool of philanthropy, even with very small dollars, to make change in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in with 2 quick points. I mean, I think, from a large foundation, perspective, this is where we get very strategic. We codified a set of arenas where, a couple of years ago, that we called issue-based change, where the foundation, which works on a systematic level, is trying to affect some change. And the arena that you've raised, and racial equity and Jews of color, etc., has been on our radar. It was on our radar before, and it'll be on our radar afterwards, along with a couple of others. And that's not to say that we were right and others were wrong. Foundations focus on different things: climate change, disability, but I think I would just dovetail very quickly to on Felicia's comments to say, I think this is a moment where, in a conversation we had with our team, recently, I said, the reality is there's only one thing that we all have control over, and that is what we do as individuals, right? We can demand that the government does this. We can demand that this foundation do that. We can do whatever we want, right? But the reality is the only thing that we have in this, that we have full control over, is what our own individual actions are in a response to any in a particular moment. And I think what is happening in our world right now, when we all witnessed, obviously the murder of George Floyd was a pivot point. There were plenty more names before that, and there will be plenty, sadly, names after that. And we have to work to watch that. But I think there was a real reckoning in the country, because I think for many of us, it was the first time we'd ever witnessed a murder. And in that respect, I think it really reinforces the individual action that needs to be taken from all of us, to respond to that. And I think that's actually what will drive the grassroots to what happens, on a larger moment. And I do like the notion of, empowerment versus equity. I have a feeling that the word inclusion is about to be passé, in some respects, because it doesn't have enough meat on the bone, so to speak, to it. But this is, this feels different than it did, 4 or 5 weeks ago. And how we react to it, I think we will be measured by down the line, as individuals and as a collective.
So thank you both. Definitely, that could be it'll be a whole other discussion. It could be, and actually maybe in our follow-up, there's a really good piece and sort of call to action for philanthropy that was put out by I'm going to probably get the name wrong, but the National African American Association of Philanthropy Executives and Foundation Executives, that we found very useful in sort of a roadmap for us. But also, I know there was a lot of individuals on the call. Like, if you're thinking, like Felicia said, like, how can I, as an individual philanthropist, even with my, $20, or make a difference in this moment? It might be something to take a look at. So let's get to some questions, and please, submit them. There was a question from Facebook Live that came in for either or both of you that, so the question is, do we keep programming with increased risk to continue to prove the need for our existence for our funders? I guess this is from a nonprofit. How, as philanthropists, do you view this and think about public health and safety versus keeping the nonprofit industry going through programs and salaries? So I guess sort of organizational needs versus individual needs.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. Appreciate the, I appreciate the question. I mean, I think there's a general strong sense, amongst philanthropy right now, that until we, anybody that says, 6 months now, we'll be back to normal, or this will be happening, like, nobody knows what's happening. So for as long as that is the case, I think there is a general sense from philanthropy that, keep going, like the expectations, if you will, or the, the need to keep delivering, so to speak, I think has been lowered. And that it is best to, really try and hunker down, keep the organization, going and flowing. And, so I'll give you a very quick example. In any year, we have a number of grantees that are up for renewal. Okay. And normally the Jim Joseph Foundation is pretty known for, like, multi-year grants, right? We are in conversation with everybody who's in renewal right now saying, look, we're going to give you like a we're going to give you a 1-year renewal, not because we don't love you and not because we don't want to keep funding you, but it's unfair to you to ask you to know what it looks like, so here's a 1-year renewal, let's just keep things humming along, etc. You know that you've got that you can guarantee the money. And I think that's generally the case. And with the one caveat, which is, I think, part of what the Aligned Grant Fund is trying to respond to, which is, there may well be opportunity out there that we can grab onto, and the phrase I've been using is, COVID-19 is an accelerant to trends that were already happening. Okay, that's a fact, right? So we knew that the retail industry is dying. It was going to die in 25 years' time. Well, now it's going to die in 10 years' time, right? So what are the accelerants that are forcing us to look at right now? So we cannot ignore online blended digital learning anymore. We just can't, right? It doesn't mean that we're all going to be doing it 100% of the time, because we're not, right? But we know that it isn't going to be ingrained in society. So I think there are some carve outs, but I think most of us are basically saying, look, just keep doing what you're doing. and then we'll get into a conversation about the future at such point where we can actually have that conversation.
Felicia, you want to add?
The only thing I would just add is really on the last sentence that Barry just said about just keep doing what you're doing, is I think that it is doing what you're doing, but also like this is a moment when every organization's ability to adapt is being tested, and some organizations will be more able to adapt than others, and that will be part of the story of sort of who, I hate to say who survives, it's such a terrible thing, but but like which organizations are going to make it into the future in their current form. And I think it's been a real, since, even though I've been almost entirely spending my time on JCRIF since all this started on the grant fund, I've been going back to Natan grant committee meetings when we've had them. And it's been such a pleasure to sit in rooms hearing from startups and new organizations, partly because the financial needs are so much smaller, and it's like such a relief after hearing from like the financial needs of the entire day school sector, like is like the meeting that you have, and then you go 10 minutes later to Natan grantees and the needs are much smaller. So it feels a little safer. But it's also like, I feel like organizations that have innovation and adaptability and flexibility and a nimbleness sort of in their DNA are going to be able to move forward in a way that's sort of like, I didn't fully understand the question, because I think it's like all of the existing needs that you had around staff and all those things, they still exist. It's just a question of how you're doing your work, and are you going to be able to keep shifting with the moment? And it's really hard. Like I literally was just talking to some day school folks, and our school is going to be able to pay, or is any organization with a physical space going to be able to afford the PPE materials that they need? How are they going to get those things? Are they going to be able to afford the staffing that it's going to take to continually clean those buildings? Our schools in particular, are they going to, and maybe synagogues too, are they going to be able to adjust their physical space according to the demands of their government, which also, by the way, may change and also vary from state to state? There is so much change afoot, we can't know it. So I guess I go back to the mindfulness, like embracing, the ambiguity and or not embracing, but at least being able to tolerate a lot of ambiguity in this moment. It's just necessary for all of us, whether we're working in nonprofits or funding them every day.
A question came in, it looks like it's from a fellow funder, just asking about red tape. The call to cut red tape is a frequent one. Do you have advice for how to cut the red tape of application process and still perform some due diligence to make sure recipients are truly helping the community we are serving? So this is probably a question that both individuals and foundations are thinking about. Like, you still want to show responsibility as a steward of resources and but you also don't want to, put organizations through hoops. How do you look at that, or any advice, especially maybe for smaller funders, I think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Really appreciate it. So, I mean, I guess, I have a pretty strong feelings about the topic, right? So, on a very practical level, one way with dealing with, red tape and needs is giving multi-year grants, right? That you don't have to, if you do it a year at a time, you've just got to, regardless of what the process is, that's a process every year as opposed to once every 3 or 4 years, right? So there's that piece of the puzzle. I think understanding and segregating your grantees, right? I guess this is public, right? The Jim Joseph Foundation has a ton of grantees. They're not of all the same import level to the Jim Joseph Foundation, right? Both from a dollar standpoint, and also from a theory of change standpoint about the work that we're trying to engage into. So we have different processes in place depending on what that different due diligence in place. So the due diligence on $100,000 grant versus the due diligence on $1 million grant are very different. Right? They have some of the same components. There's a nice chunk in the Venn diagram, but then that piece of the puzzle. And then the other thing I just say is I think there is something happening, when I first got into the field of philanthropy, nobody really talked about what databases they're using and what things they're using. And now that's changing a little bit. A number of us have all kind of working on similar systems. We've begun conversations. And the JCRIF the JCRIF Aligned Grant Fund is a great example. When 3 or 4 or 5 of the funders decide to give money to, an organization, they only have one person, one program officer is acting on behalf of all 5 of the foundations, right? So it's one report, it's one this, it's one that. And some of that has begun to happen already prior to this, where, Charlene, you and I might be on a call with the same grantee, listening to what it is that we're saying. I would say just the following: you have to marry the due diligence, of course, but the recognition is every minute that they're spending doing something for us is a minute away from the work that we're giving them money to do, right? So if that's something that we try to keep very, very, at the front of our minds. And we actually just got the beginnings of the results of the grantee perception report that we just did through the Center of Effective Philanthropy. One of our goals from the last time was to speed up the process. And I'll let you know what it says, because we're going to find out whether or not we did it or not.
You don't want to share your screen right now? We could all just
We did make progress, I know that. So, but there's other things that we didn't.
I think there's no one answer to this, and really it comes down to, again, that like diversity of perspectives, diversity of goals. I think what's really important is that any funder, individual or institutional, just right sizes their process for what Barry said, is like understanding that all of this takes the time of the organizations, but also just what your own level of trust and risk is. If you are someone who does not trust your, nonprofit partners and the people asking you for funds, then you're going to want a lot more information from them in order to feel comfortable. It's hard for me. I know the way that I want to operate. I know the way that Natan members want to operate, but even that is sort of constantly in flux. We do try to, minimize red tape and work as fast as we can. JCRIF is working at this pace. It is a relentless, amazing, relentless pace of week after week after week with new proposals, looking at really not a lot of information and making big decisions. It helps that everyone around the table is very experienced in philanthropy, knows a lot of the organizations that we're talking to already. But it's been a really interesting experiment in watching different foundations who have their own very different processes now try to come together in a very fast turnaround process that is not the way that any of us, me included, are used to working, really. And one of the things that for sure will come out of this is something the philanthropy world has talked about forever, which is common grant applications. I'm not saying common grant applications will come out of this, but what happens here, what's happening in this moment, and all of the philanthropic collaboration that we're seeing far beyond JCRIF sort of gives everyone a real life experience of common grant applications. So when we launched Amplifier in 2014 in partnership with the Schusterman Foundation, we created a website that had common grant applications on it, because we thought, wow, if we're going to go out and create a whole bunch of giving circles in the world, we don't want to exponentially increase the demands on organizations' times.
And that's what Amplifier does, right? It's an incubator of giving circles.
Right. Amplifier,
just to explain it.
Right. The Amplifier helps to start and sustain giving circles inspired by Jewish values and other kinds of forms of collaborative giving, not just giving circles. We created that common grant application mostly because at every Jewish Funders Network conference I would go to, there would be a conversation about how we needed common grant applications. So we created it and almost nobody used it, because even though you can have all the respect in the world for organizations' time, and we do, we still have unique things that we want to ask, ask organizations in terms of our own goals. So the last piece is just to go back to what Barry said a minute ago about people in JCRIF having to give up something. It will be really interesting moving forward to see if funders will be able to kind of give up some of the uniqueness of their process in order to be able to do more things together. And maybe, as Barry said, it'll be a balance of like being able to do things your own way with your own flavor in one part of your funding, and then being able to do things more collaboratively with this consensus. Nothing is perfect. It's not the way any of us would make it on our own, but we recognize that we have to compromise if we want to do things together. That'll be really interesting. We'll have to do this again in 5 years and see how it all pans out.
I hope we can do it again sooner than that. But yeah, for sure. I mean, at the way time seems to be moving, like next month is going to feel like 5 years at least. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first, I know this has come up a lot in some of my conversations with grantees. We have some viewers from Israel, and maybe this is primarily for you, Felicia, because I know Jim Joseph Barry doesn't give to Israel, although you may have some thoughts on this, just how you see, there's a question about how you see COVID and the pandemic and needs in this country, especially given the fact that the United States has been so severely affected in the world, and how it relates to the relationship historically and currently between Jewish philanthropy and Israel.
It's a great question. And one of the really interesting things that I have seen over the last few months is much more interest from Israeli funders and the Israeli government in funding things in Jewish communities in the United States. And I was on a webinar, it feels like 100 years ago, for a conference I was in Israel. It was probably like a month ago. And we were talking about exactly this. People in Israel are looking at what's happening in Jewish communities outside of Israel and saying like, oh, wow, that's a really big problem. And Israel is in a different place, many Israelis, and the government as well, in a different place economically, than it ever has been in terms of its ability to actually now maybe like reverse that, where it used to be that American Jews sent their money to Israel. Now we see money going the other way as well. That is so fascinating. It's also a story of the evolution of the ecosystem of philanthropy in Israel itself. And that'll be another thing in 5 years or 5 minutes, whenever we get together again, that'll be another thing really to have looked at, is to see how the flow shifted at all. I think it really is shifting. We'll just see how material it is over time.
Barry, any thoughts you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, I remember. I'll just say I remember about 9 or 10 years ago. I was visiting a friend on the East Coast, and went with her to pick up her kids from day school. And she took me around this magnificent facility, and we're looking at the names, and and I'm like, well, I've never heard of that family. And it was a family that was an Israeli family, right? I said, a family that made Aliyah, and they were like, no, this is like a Sabra family. And so, I mean, I think we're seeing some of this unfold, right now, not just as it relates to philanthropy, but I think as it relates to the nature of the nature of the relationship, which is moving very swiftly from some type of maternal paternal relationship that North American Jewry has, to one that is different and changed. I think the question that I will just say that I have often thought about is, if you follow that metaphor all the way, right? If it was viewed as America helped birth the state, American philanthropy helped birth the state, well, now Israel's kind of gone to college and said maybe like the relationship's different. If you follow all the way through to the end of a life, what happens? The kid ends up taking care of the parents. And I think, I don't ascribe to that, in this particular scenario right now, but I think it's one that actually merits, when I saw the question come up, a real deep conversation. It's a fascinating question.
It is, and it even extends, beyond Israel. I mean, I think like if there's anything that COVID has uncovered for us, that we didn't know it already, it's how connected we are, in our world. I mean, and how we do share, certainly with Israel, but a common destiny. I mean, the pandemic has revealed that very much, in many ways, and you know, we also, Felicia, looked at Israel. I was in Israel when they started to shut down travel there. I think I was one of the last flights that left. And as it turned out, frankly, if they would have shut US, I mean, they said a third of their cases were brought in from the US. So it's very interlinked. And there's a whole other field of like, how will the shutdown of travel affect these sorts of connections, whether it be for Israel or global. So definitely a to be continued kind of a question, but I know one that we're all thinking about as well. So we have, I'm just going to ask one final question because then we have to wrap up, and we're so appreciative of your time and your wisdom and just your generosity of spirit in sharing with us. And there's a question that came in from the audience that I think might be a fun one, which was, what one thing has COVID, I guess the quarantine, or changed about doing your job, like on kind of your daily life, whether it's doing your job or otherwise, that you think you want to make a permanent change, or you think will be a permanent change? Whoever wants to start can start.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, sure. I mean, I'll take a crack. And thank you for having me again, Charlene. I much appreciate it. It really, I do mean that. It's a gift to be able to reflect a little bit for me personally, you know, in the constant running the marathon that we seem to have been ill prepared for. So I appreciate the moment to take a breath and just think about things. I think there are two things. I think, first of all, the movement, one is internal and one is external. The internal one for me is that the recognition that building a culture needs to happen face to face is no longer holds the same amount of truth than it did for me several months ago. I think we've experienced different ways that our team has actually, I think, gotten closer with one another in very real and fundamental ways. And so that's making me, you know, very much rethink, you know, how when we do go back, what that looks like and how that looks, you know. So that's definitely changed. And the second thing that's changed for me is, you know, look, I was, you know, whatever the high status is with United Airlines, I had it, right? You know, it was like a badge of honor, you know. I'm sure you're the same way, Charlene, with your multiple trips around the country and around the world. And, you know, the reality is we're a people that like to gather, right? We like to conference, we like to do, you know, we like to do our site visits, we like to go see and whatever. And I think that, you know, not doing that for the last 12 weeks, which is the longest stretch in my career of not getting on an airplane, has actually made me realize, am I any not as close to things than I need to be? I don't think I am. So I think I think long term is going to make me think a little bit about what do I really have to go to, what do I really have to be to. And perhaps spending, you know, more time, more time, you know, in the office or, you know, here on Zoom. There are advantages to it, which has definitely, definitely been a change.
Funny.
I am devastated, though, that I'm probably not a platinum medallion anymore, the One Delta, I have to say. But sorry, Felicia. Go ahead.
I feel like a child compared to you guys with your miles. Like I finally got to gold on Delta, and now I just like, when's that ever going to happen again?
It's not as good as it sounds.
Really
they don't even give you free peanuts anymore.
You know what Barry just said, two things that were interesting and a little bit contradictory, actually. And he thanked you, and I agree, and I want to echo the gratitude for the opportunity to reflect, and then talked about how maybe we ought, you know, we can be choosier with where we go in the future. And the one thing I would say that really feels limited for me right now is the opportunity to reflect with people at length, which I think happens when you're together more than it happens when you're on Zoom. But so I want to think about that a little bit more. I would say that the thing, this is personal and professional, just imagining, I think my family and I and our, you know, and our team at Natan and our members and the grantees, like imagining that things are linear and that we have a set of expectations, you know, for what the next day or the future is going to look like. And we're on just sort of one path for that I feel like has been broken wide open. And the best example I can give on a personal level Barry knows the story already, is that my son was, both of us, Barry and I both have high school seniors, and my son was supposed to go to Tufts in the fall and just decided actually to go on a gap year to Israel with Barry's son, which we did not plan, but it's a happy accident, happy coincidence. That was not ever anything that he had imagined doing, going on a gap year or going to Israel or not being at Tufts in the fall. He was on like one path. And this has given him, all of us, the opportunity to be just on a different path and to be on no path, like kind of not to know exactly what the path is, but to just trust that we're, with each step, if we're being sort of gracious and generous and thoughtful, intentional, that we're headed someplace that will be okay. I want to try to thank you for this therapy session for me. I want to keep trying to maintain that sense of like, I don't know what the outcome is. It's not linear, and it's going to be okay.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, all those adjectives you just used to describe the process, or the, you know, thoughtful, intentional, generous. I just want to say to the both of you, you are just such, you know, leaders and colleagues, and just your empathy and your generosity of spirit and time, it isn't taken for granted. Barry, you were talking about some of the negative things about kind of how you're perceived as a funder, and, you know, but also like, you know, I kind of take compliments with a grain of salt. I mean, and so, but I have nothing that I'm trying to get, because this is now, I'm really saying this with a full and authentic heart. You both said yes right away to this opportunity, and you have incredibly busy schedules, and we're so grateful, and really, really, really thank you for your time and your friendship, which means a lot. So with that, Jenny, do you want to come back on for any final announcements before we say goodbye?
We are working on a robust virtual, you know, summer, fall lineup of these types of programs. And it's just really a blessing that we're able to bring in resources that we wouldn't otherwise do if we were in person. And so I think it's really important during this time that we are taking advantage and broadening our worlds a little bit, and bringing two such wonderful people into our San Diego world, and also welcoming viewers. We have lots of friends from Jerusalem joining in today. So thank you. Good night to all of you who stayed up late in Jerusalem. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.